During an earthquake, this is the big dog. The dome is the dog, the big guy. Where he wants to go, everybody else has to get out of the way. So when this 40 million pounds says, I want to go that way, the Senate wing needs to move. If it wants to go that way, the House wing has to move. And so controlling this central mass of the rotunda and the upper rotunda and the domes is the key in trying to improve the performance of the building. In all the earthquakes, 1949, 1965, 2001, most of the damage has been in this level of the colonnade. This is, if you will, the weak link of the building. We have all the weight of the upper dome sitting on this column-like structure with the masonry buttresses or the brick buttresses. And this is the area that tends to slide back and forth. The building was built under 2 contracts. And when they stopped the first contract, completed the first contract, they covered this whole area with copper flashing to keep it waterproof. And then when the second contract came in, they built everything on top of this piece of copper flashing, and it just gives us a beautiful slip plane for everything to move. In 1949, most of the damage, they believe, was confined to the lantern, which is the structure on top. And in fact, they tore the lantern off completely and replaced it with what we see today.
My grandfather was hired after the 1949 earthquake to be the foreman on the crew that deconstructed and reconstructed the cupola and the lantern from the damage that happened during the earthquake. The lantern had to be dismantled and reconstructed. Basically, it's a 180-ton piece of, several pieces of stone that held it in place. So what they had to do is they had to come up here, take it apart piece by piece. They numbered it. They built a tramway on the south side of the building, and that's how they carried the stone down and then carried it back up.
They built this enormous escalator down the front of the building here. The historic photos are just cool. It's like the world's biggest slide, and they brought all the stones down in a controlled manner.
And then in order to take some of the weight off, they fabricated a steel frame in the shape of the cupola and tied it to a steel part of the lower dome for seismic bracing. And then what they did is they hollowed out the stone that was previously up here so that it could be placed onto the steel frame. And piece by piece, they put it back together. The main change from the original cupola, because of that work, was that they placed a lightweight nickel alloy cap and ball on the top as opposed to the stone cupola that was up there. So 70 tons lighter now and seismically braced.
1949, Cub Scout Den was up here during the earthquake. And I think it took them 4 or 5 hours to get down after the earthquake because the elevator wasn't working. This used to be a public access area. And so they had them kiss the ground when they got to all the way down. The further you are away from the base of the structure, the more it amplifies the earthquake motion. So where we're standing is feeling roughly 2 to 3 times the amount of motion that you would feel on the ground. So if you were a Cub Scout Den standing here in 1949 in a roughly magnitude 7 earthquake, I imagine you were pretty scared and you were pretty happy to get back down to the ground. The 1965 earthquake is the second earthquake to the building, and as the whole thing moved around during the earthquake, it led to cracks in the drum. They added a concrete cylindrical wall. It just kind of fits inside of the colonnade drum. And if you look up, you'll notice that there aren't as many windows on the inside of the colonnade as you will see on the outside. That's because the concrete wall covered up some of the windows. This 1965 wall that was added by Vic Gray and the engineers at that time is probably the single most important improvement to the building that's been done to strengthen it, to make it stronger for earthquakes. The neat thing is 1965 versus today, all they did was throw a little caution tape around the rotunda, tell everybody to stay out of the rotunda, and they reopened the building. And you compare that to 2001, where we kept the building closed for 6 weeks while we did all the emergency repairs and made sure everything was stabilized. That's another interesting thing about 1965. The engineer could say, I need more wall, And the architect and the historics people would just say, yeah, you can have more wall. Today, this is a historic landmark building. As such, you cannot do things to repair it which would impact the historic fabric of the building. When the 2001 Nisqually earthquake happened, I like to say that one of the reasons this building did so well was all the money the state spent in 1949 and in 1965. And they also did a voluntary seismic upgrade of the House and Senate wings in 1972-73. And all that money really was a great investment come, February 28th. During the earthquake, one of the things that I immediately heard on the TV and on the radio was that the dome had a big crack in it. And when we got here, what we saw was that some of these veneer stones had shifted outward, and that was actually the damage. So the primary structure did quite well, but some of the finish had shifted. And one of those stones up above that had shifted, that weighed about 1,600 pounds, was precariously captured, almost ready to fall out. And that's why the building was closed. Until we could remove that stone, we didn't feel it was safe to have anybody underneath. When we walked out here to inspect these, we found a lot of signs of cracking. And what we saw were these columns had moved, and the repair involved drilling a hole that was roughly 3 inches in diameter, 65 feet down through the center of those columns, and installing a piece of steel rebar and filling the hole back up with grout. And that pinned those columns so they'll never walk out again. And if you can imagine, every piece of rebar that was used on the project was brought up these spiral stairs. And these columns appeared to have shifted, and so we opened these up and then could look inside and see the steel structure and inside and inspect those. In fact, this one that I'm touching, I believe, is one of the ones that I opened. And you can't even tell when the artisans came in and put it all back together and redid the paintwork. We'd actually opened this up to look at it for earthquake damage. See this? That's where it slid. When it was built, this wall was perfectly straight. And you can see that the domes were moving that way. And there's that roughly 3/4 of an inch right here that the whole thing just slid. One of the things that we did to improve the earthquake strength of the building is we connected this 1965 wall, which was not connected to the arches. It just sat on top of it. So all of this new concrete right here connects this wall to the arches. You'll see these enormous bolts, and these bolts connect to new concrete walls that I added inside the catacombs. The idea is to improve the strength for sliding. We're trying to keep this thing from sliding. We're also trying to keep it from rocking. So it's pretty neat. The trucks would show up downstairs and it would pump the concrete up to this level. The thing that I was most impressed with as I looked down on the dome is that it looked like the whole dome had been covered with sand. As everything moved around, the mortar joints worked and it freed up a lot of sand, and everywhere you would look, you would see sand. We would look out at the neighborhood after the earthquake and the number of chimneys that fell down. This was the third major earthquake to hit this area. You would have thought all the chimneys had fallen down a long time ago, but apparently they just keep putting them right back up the way they did them before, because all you could do for months after the earthquake, you would look out across this neighborhood and just see blue tarps at every chimney. And every now and then you work on this building, you work on it for a long time on paper and you get used to the scale of it, and then you come back up here and you go, oh my God. Yeah, it is really a big, impressive building.